Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, the nation's oldest public affairs discussion forum. I'm Cole Thomas Enritis on behalf of the member-led Arts Forum here at the Commonwealth, an educational content curator with the Department of Diversity, Equity, and Community at San Francisco Opera. We are pleased to welcome club members as well as new listeners who are tuned in today. We would love for us all to be gathered at the Rembe Rock Auditorium with you, but circumstances dictate that today's program be virtual rather than in person as originally scheduled. For any friends and supporters who could not be with us, and those of you who just can't wait to watch it again, the recording of this program will be available within the next few days on the club's website in the Watch and Listen section. Our topic for today, who is Cleopatra? Indeed, for centuries, the persona of Cleopatra has been molded as an archetype of female power and beauty. Yet, as with most tellings of history, her story has been mostly written by men who never knew her. Providing another context, in concurrence with San Francisco Opera's centennial season and the world premiere of John Adams' Antony and Cleopatra, we've assembled a panel of women in the arts to ask and answer the question, who is Cleopatra? How has she been misjudged, mistreated, and misportrayed throughout history and the arts? Moderating our panel today is Erin Neff, member of the renowned San Francisco Opera Chorus. She's joined by Rita Lucarelli, Associate Professor of Egyptology at University of California, Berkeley, Elkanah Pulitzer, Director of San Francisco Opera's world premiere production of John Adams' Antony and Cleopatra, and Sherry Young, Founder and Executive Director of the African American Shakespeare Company. We invite our panelists to ask questions of each other and even of this audience as we progress through this hour together. We also invite you, our viewers, to submit questions. We'll do our best to answer them all. Without further ado, I hand things over to our moderator, Erin Neff, and this distinguished panel to discuss the question, who is Cleopatra? Erin, please take it away.
Thank you, Cole. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us here today. This, of course, is prompted by the Antony and Cleopatra that just premiered last week at the San Francisco Opera. Super excited to be here talking about Cleopatra. I would love to ask Rita for you to begin and give us some historical context of who Cleopatra was and the time period in which she lived.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, it's my pleasure to be here indeed and provide an historical context for Cleopatra and especially how she looks like in the ancient sources. And so I prepared some images too. But I would say we have to start thinking to the fact that we did not find the body of Cleopatra, so we don't know how she looks like, since one of the first questions is always how Cleopatra looks like, how she was seen by his contemporaries. We don't know exactly that, but what we know is how she wanted to be represented. And I hope to show today, and then we can discuss it, that her chosen identity was the identity of an Egyptian woman, a royal Egyptian woman. And the portraits that we have of her as an Hellenistic and then Roman style female figure are indeed to be contextualized within Roman Egypt. And in fact, she was the daughter of Ptolemy XII, who was one of the last rulers of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. So they were Macedonians originally, but at the time when Cleopatra ruled in Egypt, the family was there since more than 200 years. So from that, we also understand why she felt this Egyptian identity. And also what was characteristic of the Ptolemaic dynasty is that the queen often was a co-ruler of the man. And that was something that the Romans could not really accept. It wasn't in the Roman tradition, while instead, within the pharaonic Egypt, within previous historical period in Egypt, we have powerful queens. So I'll show you some images that could really illustrate how powerful these Egyptian royal women were, and how Cleopatra really wanted to identify herself as one of them. I'll try to now share my screen. Let me see. Can you see here the screen? My screen in the good way?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Great.
Right. So I'll just start. So I'll go through those very quickly, and then if you like, we can go back to it. But this is a bit the classical statue of Cleopatra, Hellenistic Ptolemaic style. So you can see it's not the typical pharaonic Egyptian figure, but there is a strong Egyptian element, and this triple uraeus. And the cobra, the uraeus, was a very powerful royal symbol in ancient Egypt since the 3rd millennium BC. And so while the pharaonic kings generally had one or two uraeus, in the Ptolemaic period, we have queens with three of these cobras on. This was definitely a very strong Egyptian royal symbol. But we have beautiful images of the queen in Egyptian temples, especially in the temple of the goddess Hathor in Dendera, which is in southern Egypt, even more south than Luxor. And in the temple of Dendera, she appears totally Egyptian, like an Egyptian queen, but also very often as an Egyptian goddess. And I guess we will talk about the divinity of Cleopatra later, but you can see here the headdress with the solar disk and cow horns, which were proper of the goddess Isis or Hathor, the signs, divine signs of the Ankh, the life sign, which was a divine attribute, but also the scepter that was instead a royal attribute. So she's queen and she's a goddess on those temples, especially the one in Dendera. And here another one from another very beautiful temple, the temple of the god Horus, the falcon god, found in Edfu, also in southern Egypt. And in the Ptolemaic period, the Ptolemaic rulers, and then the Romans too, were still building new temples and add extra building to the temples that were there already, and they were depicting themselves as pharaohs. And so the queens, the Ptolemaic queens, were also present there, including Cleopatra. And this is probably the most famous representation of Cleopatra with his son, Caesarion, or Ptolemy 15. And here, well, it's only part of this big scene, this large scene. They are offering to the gods Osiris and Isis. Oops, and that one. So this is also a typical offering scene of Egyptian temples that we find really since the pharaonic period, 2nd and 1st millennium BC. And you can see also all the inscriptions are in hieroglyphs, the names of the king and queen in a cartouche. So the tradition is really the pharaonic one. And we can see from all these sources how Cleopatra really indeed identified herself as an Egyptian queen, we could say as an African queen, and really went back to the Egyptian tradition.
Rita, I want to just ask you, since we're just looking at these images, we will be talking more about race in a bit, but just to comment a little bit, I assume this is a bas-relief, although this is in black and white. There was a slide a couple slides ago that had some coloration, and we're seeing, I just want people to take note of features and coloration as potential hints about her race. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, sure. Indeed, all those reliefs were originally colored. We know all statues in antiquity actually were colored too. And this is in black and white, but I like this photo because it really shows also these beautiful details of her headrest. The vulture was another symbol of queenship in ancient Egypt. The vulture goddess was very important. And those are really old symbols. So again, in the tradition of the Ptolemaic dynasty, all those pharaonic symbols were used still in temples, in religious sculpture. And here we see instead a relief representing the father of Cleopatra. And that's an important figure because indeed Cleopatra started to be co-ruler of his father when she was just 17. Her father was a prolific builder. Some scholars say, well, he was a prolific builder because he was actually a weak king, and so, but he wanted to show to be strong. But thanks to him, indeed, Cleopatra became co-ruler and then ruler of Egypt. It's interesting how the same name of Cleopatra, it means glory of his father. And it's interesting that in ancient Egyptian as well, we don't have a term for queen. Queens were always indicated as the king's wife, the king's daughter. They had titles connected to the male figure. Despite that, some of them became rulers and had to rule like pharaohs. And I'll show you other powerful queens in a moment. But I also wanted to show you this very interesting statues that was discovered in sandstone. Was discovered near the Temple of Hathor in Dendera again. And first was interpreted as the statue of two Egyptian gods. But later on, an Egyptologist gave an interesting interpretation, and I agree with her, that basically those are the twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene II, of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. It's a beautiful, they are also depicted in the Egyptian style with the side lock that is typical of Egyptian children, and they hold some snakes, and it's not very evident in this picture, but they represent also the moon and the sun, and it is said in the sources they were born during the eclipse. So there is a lot of Egyptian symbology there. Maybe you can note here the Eye of Horus, also a very powerful Egyptian amulet. So, and this is really unique piece that especially Alexander Helios has never been represented. We have some representation only of the daughter Cleopatra Selene, but not of him.
Rita, I'm just going to interrupt you just for a second because there's so much happening here.
I'm trying to.
I'd love to just touch on just the divinity figures and how that played into Cleopatra's her political strategy and why this was important. Could you speak a little bit about that, or maybe Elkanah? I'd love to hear you. I know you did a lot of research on this for the opera.
Sure. I don't know if Elkanah wants to.
Rita, why don't you continue, and I'll sort of try to, everything you're raising, we have some representations of some of these aspects in the production, which I can speak to, but you're doing great. So I'm learning a lot.
I'm trying to be short, although there's so much interesting material I would like to share, but of course, there is also some great bibliography on Cleopatra that is possible to check. But I think the visuals are important. And for instance, see the difference of how Cleopatra then is represented instead, for instance, in this marble bust of Cleopatra this is much later, 30 BC, and on the coins she appears with Mark Antony. Oops. The interesting thing, so this is of course really the Roman style, the Roman Cleopatra, which has been also seen as less beautiful. But well, the conception of what is beautiful, of course, depends from the context, and this kind of representation of Cleopatra, Roman style, was also a sign of a powerful woman within the Roman world. So it's actually was a positive way to represent Cleopatra as well as in the coins. The very interesting thing is that generally in those kind of coins, the wife of the ruler appears behind him on the same face of the coins, while for the coins with Mark Antony and Cleopatra is her own side of the coin. So almost as if she's really important, and Mark Antony recognized that. I thought it was a really great aspect, a great detail to point out to. Just to conclude, as I told you, Cleopatra was following the tradition of powerful Egyptian queens, and definitely everybody knows Hatshepsut, the so-called, it's been called the Queen Pharaoh. Hatshepsut actually in many portraits appears also as a woman. She changed her representations only when really she became the only ruler, because at the beginning she was a co-ruler with her stepson. So in the moment in which she became the ruler, she wanted to be represented as a male. Indeed, we see the royal beard, typical of the pharaohs, and so it became the symbol of a very powerful queen. And another important figure, those are all of the so-called 18 dynasties. So much earlier, we are here at around 1300 BC, the 18th dynasty in ancient Egypt. So Queen Tiye is the mother of the famous pharaoh Akhenaton, the so-called heretic pharaoh. And indeed, speaking about race, generally, this particular sculpture is used to show the African origin of ancient Egyptians, especially ancient Egyptian in the south. And Queen Tiye, we know from the sources, was politically powerful and influence, as well as the wife of Akhenaton, the beautiful Nefertiti. We have representation of her with also crowns which are warrior crowns. So beside the female beauty, there was always the aspect of the warrior, of the powerful queen that Cleopatra embedded as well. And this could be connected to the idea also of a feminine divinity in ancient Egypt. Goddesses in ancient Egypt are benevolent, but they can also be dangerous and they can be aggressive. They have a power that can go in two directions. So the idea of having a strong ruler who in certain moments can be even cruel and is connected to violent acts is actually attested in the Egyptian sources also before. But I don't want to talk too much actually, because I'm also looking forward to hear what all of you are going to say. This was just to provide some visuals for you and start the discussion.
Well, if I could ask a question, Rita, I always thought the Romans did not like Cleopatra because of her sway with Julius Caesar and then later with Mark Antony. So I find it interesting that they're creating a coin with her as a Roman, because they were very against her acquiring any wealth from Rome or their country. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, those coins were, of course, produced in the time when Cleopatra was in a good relationship with the important Roman men. So we have Cleopatra has been traveling also to Rome. We don't know if very often in more trips or just one longer trips, but she was in Rome, and we have sources where actually they are not completely negative. They recognize that she's a powerful woman. The only thing is that they could not understand how a woman could be so powerful. That was not part of the Roman tradition, where only indeed men could hold political powers. So, but we have also Roman sources where Cleopatra is not seen so negatively. And we have what is never mentioned is that beside the Roman, we have also, for instance, early medieval Muslim sources, which really talk about Cleopatra as an well-educated polyglot woman a lot. And also those early medieval authors, they've been using the same Roman sources. So it's not that there's nothing good about Cleopatra in the Roman authors, only, let's say, in the European tradition, for some reason, I mean, we know the reason. The negative sides of Cleopatra have been highlighted.
Can I jump in? I mean, in terms of the minting of the coins, those were also related to the donations of Alexandria,
Right.
which was not an event that was controlled by Rome, exclusively. I mean, it was Antony's assertion in, sort of the Roman view of recarving and recalibrating the entire sort of political agenda to reallocate all the lands to their children and erase Caesarion, as you had pointed out earlier, to sort of the rightful position as descendant of Julius Caesar, her former lover and child. But some also argue that was a marriage, right, between the two of them, and that the minting of the coin solidified their political position, and assertion that the new Roman Empire would rest seated in Alexandria and not Rome, which obviously failed in terms of the long-term picture. But one of the things I also want to mention is that we talked a lot about, why is she glorified in Roman eyes? Even in the references, in Plutarch, if you look at her death and the honorable suicide, and even in the Shakespeare play, Caesar gets the last word, and it's one of eloquence and allowing them to be buried together, and that they'll be born together, not lauded, but ultimately his victory is more potent if he has had an adversary who he's triumphed over, who was a worthy one. And so giving her more authority in a way also was about asserting his dominance over that authority.
And the donations of Alexandria, was that a tipping point for Rome because she was allocating all these regions to her children?
Yes. Yeah. Antony and she essentially created a ceremony, that I would say sent some serious ripples across the Mediterranean to Rome, and created Octavian. And we haven't really talked about who is Octavian. He became, Caesar Augustus. He would essentially hire Plutarch to write an account of all of these, narratives. He would commission the Aeneid and become, a descendant of Apollo himself in terms of how they're all fashioning themselves as gods. He also did some dirty dealings where he went into the Vestal Virgin's temple and supposedly got Antony's will and read it aloud in the Republic, and essentially said that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria. So suddenly, which was, again, not even to honor or be acknowledged in terms of citizenship. If you were not Roman and of Rome, you were essentially for sure a second class, not even citizen. So the idea that for Rome, Antony would want to be buried in Egypt or have allegiance or reallocate Roman seat of authority, to Alexandria was preposterous and leveled the playing field for Rome to support Caesar declaring war against Egypt, of course, not a civil war against Antony, which is really what it was.
And so what we know of Cleopatra is that she began her reign as the leader when she was 17 years old.
Yes.
Rita? Yes.
That was 18. I thought it was 18.
Well, and it was a co-rulership, right? Because she co-ruled with two individual brothers, and then of course the old, marrying one's sibling and then having them killed. That was very much a part of the royal machinations as well. She also witnessed her sister being dragged, through the streets of Rome in triumph by Julius Caesar. So she knew what a Roman triumph looked like and how people were treated. And so at the end of our story, when she gets confirmation that that's what Caesar intends for her, it's even more reason why she will commit suicide, because as we all know of great rulers, you cannot step down, right? There's either you rule or you die. There's really nothing in between. And what makes her remarkable in history, I think there have been plenty of queens who co-ruled who did die, but she went out on her own terms,
Yeah, it's interesting because the case of the suicide of Cleopatra can be contextualized in this ethics of suicide in antiquity, because we have different cases and different reasons. Even there is an ancient Egyptian tale where there is a case of a man who wants to kill himself because he's unhappy about the political and social situation around him, which is very different from the suicide of a leader, of a ruler. And then generally in similar case, the cause is pudor, so-called. So basically the reason is no longer being what you used to be, let's say, and then you just want to escape captivity. And so of course this together with despair also for
see, that's very interesting to me, because when I think about Cleopatra, one of the primary things is how fierce she is and was throughout her life. She did so many remarkable things that we as modern day women in society, I couldn't even fathom of. Just the fact of, so she had Julius Caesar as one of her lovers. And it was well known that she wrapped herself in the rug, which was portrayed with the Elizabeth Taylor. And while it seemed like very Hollywood-esque, antics, apparently it was a true situation. And at such a young age, she was deemed as being a whore to some people. But in my eyes, it was about survival. People thought that she was manipulative. And in my eye, a woman is called manipulative, a man is called being strategic. So to me, as a young female ruler, she used everything in her assets. She used her beauty, she used her sexuality, she used her strength. And for some, she was demonized for that. But she was such a survivor that I'm a little surprised that she would kill herself instead of trying to reinvent herself like she had in her X amount of years of ruling.
Well, she certainly had a flair for the dramatic, and she was an incredibly highly educated person. It was all about power. Probably every single perspective was about how to remain in power, as people in power do. You're not necessarily, your goal is to be happy in life, but your goal is to remain happy. And this was a woman who was very educated, right? A polyglot, the only ruler who spoke of this monarchy, of this dynasty, who spoke Egyptian. She spoke the people's language. And I definitely, there's lots of historical references to the drama of it. comparing her, or Elkanah, I wanted to ask you about her coupling with these different divinity and how that was strategically really smart.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, again, speaking just more towards the Shakespeare and the text embedded in it that goes back to Plutarch and, again, a Roman lens of the accounts of the time. But we know that, again, back to what Rita was talking about in terms of a Hellenistic influence, which predates Roman gods, right? That's a lot of the inspiration comes from the Hellenistic Greek sort of origin stories, right, of those gods and goddesses. So she had that through, the Ptolemaic line from Alexander the Great and her Macedonian heritage, right? And then she also wisely took from the gods and goddesses of Egypt. And so she was kind of a hybrid of Aphrodite and Isis. And Antony identified with Hercules and also with Osiris. And so this idea of taking kind of a amalgamation or hippogriff of different religious iconography from varying sources and presenting that to the public seems to me extremely savvy, because you're not really omitting anyone who of any particular faith or interest in terms of the narrative. Like, that is for sure a great way of gathering the people. And in terms of the some of the biographies about her, the Cleopatra by Schiff, that won a Pulitzer and is a really fun read. She talks about also how Cleopatra did an Egyptian ceremony and went, on a barge next to a deified cow that was sacred, and traveled to different towns and really fully embraced and embodied and elevated, her people's faith, and was the embodiment of Isis. And what does it mean to rule believing that you are truly divine? I'm sure it's an entirely different set of existential questions that one wakes up with compared to just being mortal.
Yeah, it's interesting that she chose a title that is New Isis. So it's like sort of reincarnation of the older Egyptian Isis. At the same time, she took also the Greek title of Thea, goddess. So indeed, as you say, she wanted to make everybody happy, but the tradition anyway to become a goddess is also traditionally, at least for the ancient Egyptians, was for the king and the queen to become intermediary between the divine word and the people. And let's not forget that there was also a cult of Cleopatra, which in Egypt, which survived around 350 years after her death. There are still statues of Cleopatra as goddess that were venerated in temples. And so it was pretty impressive the way she became popular despite the suicide. She still was considered goddess. That's
well, to me, her being goddess is just a testament to what people do with social media. If you're in a culture where your survival is you have to kill your brother and mothers are killing their sons and husbands, then elevating yourself to a deity is really the best way to assure, do not touch this person. So to me, that's just very smart. You have the winged eyes, like fashion look. She had the breastbone, like decor around her neck and shoulders. And that is the best way to elevate yourself, to keep you safe. And also it's a PR. You go around and you're in all this garb with your entourage. that is great publicity. So
She was also the wealthiest woman in the world at her time, right? The Nile and the abundance of that in terms of fertility of crops. She did have to manage droughts and starvation and allocation of grains, but Rome wanted her in alliance because of her wealth and her resources, and so that's a big deal too, right? In terms of she wasn't just some sort of bit player at the table. I mean, she was an essential ally for Rome in order to fund armies. I mean, military takes money and people, and she had the money for sure.
So do you think it was problematic for her that she was a woman, or do you think it worked in her favor? Would this situation have been different for a man? This is male or female. She was incredibly intelligent. What sort of, besides that the rulers in Rome were not psyched about the fact that she was a woman, and maybe that goes into some sort of comparison. Yeah, Sherry.
I think that they discounted her. I think as a woman, the Romans did not really equate her at their level. So they just probably discounted her early on. But as a woman, I believe that she was able to kind of, and I'll use their words, manipulate relationships, situation, that she was able to stronghold her relationship with Caesar and others in Rome to the point where she kind of safeguarded herself and they didn't see it coming. Kind of like, well, I won't make a comparison.
Well, certainly a man could not have had children with Caesar or Antony.
I heard
that's the dynamics of all this about seduction. And I mean, the positive side is, as a political force to be reckoned with, she created progeny that created, a bloodline alliance between Rome and Alexandria, between two great nations. And so arguably, what is more effective politically in the grand scheme of things than to birth a child who is essentially the heir to two different kingdoms? A man cannot do that, just to be clear. But on the flip side, there's all this, she's a gypsy, she's a whore, she's a seductress. He is the bellows for her, heat, all that. That is the cliche of Cleopatra being essentially like a sex kitten. Again, denying and diminishing the potency of her ability to create these alliances and have these children.
Yeah, and speaking about that again, the cliche indeed is that the Romans did not like her. But for instance, I was looking into statues of Cleopatra as a goddess. One is being found in Rome near an Isis temple, because the Egyptian cults, especially the cult of Isis and Osiris, became very popular in Rome. So the Romans were the first Egyptomaniacs. So they basically, there are more obelisks in Rome today than in Egypt, because they took them out and brought them to Rome. It's kind of crazy but to believe, but I always tell my students that if you want to look at obelisk, go to Rome. And so, there was a fascination within the Roman world for the queen. It's not just the sources that depict her as a war. Those are the sources that have been, at least that's my understanding, have been used mostly also in later traditions, and even Shakespeare has been influenced by
that leads us to sort of how she's represented in modern day. Also, I want to touch on what Alkana just said, how she's described as a whore, as a gypsy, and gypsies we know are dark-skinned. Well, let's open up this discussion about her race and if she was African, if she was Eastern European. Is this important? Was it important then? Is it important now? Sherry.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Sherry.
Well, I think race gives justification for lowering status of people depending on where you are. And the African continent is very wide and vast. There's a rainbow of shades and cultures within that continent. So while I've heard and read a lot that she's Macedonian in features, no one knows of, or I haven't heard of where her mother's from. And I heard that her mother was from African descent. Which part of Africa, I don't know. Of course, I'll leave that to Rita about the the study of Egypt. But I believe that race does matter because it tells part of the story, part of the experience, and you see that when they have the two different figures of her in Rome, she has a very narrow nose that's a little bit, crooked down. And when you see her from the Egyptian statues, it's a little bit different. And they wing the eyes and have the eyelids a little bit broader and upswept. So I think people want to claim those who are descendant from them. And, I will always say that Cleopatra is the Egyptian queen, and she's of some African descent in her. What percentage? I don't know.
And Sherry, do you think that it was important while she was alive, what race she was?
I think it has some importance. I don't think it was everything, because they seem to accept her at face value. I think they love the wealth of Egypt. Egypt was so plentiful that there were rumors if you have a certain crop in Egypt, that crop would be 4 times as great. If they had like multiple births, if a cow had 1 calf, in Egypt, they would have 3 calves, in the same birth. So Egypt was so wealthy. I think race wasn't the primary factor in a lot of the ways she's written about, but it was more about who she was, what she bring, what she did that really, was the primary focus of a lot of the things that I was reading about Cleopatra. But in a modern day context, especially being an African-American woman, we like to identify with who else in this world and in historical content was disqualified of being from African descent. Like, where are those benefits that we can kind of link and say, yes, this is part of our ancestor? So to the modern day context, it's very important. When it was happening during her time, I haven't read anything where that was the main issue, because if they wanted to trash, if the Romans or anyone else wanted to trash Cleopatra, they could have brought up the race as an issue, and that doesn't seem to be part of the conversation.
Elkanah, would you like to speak to this?
I think what's interesting is if you think about the amount of cross-pollination of ideas and of peoples across the Mediterranean, for, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years prior her birth. I agree that I think it becomes more relevant in a current context in terms of talking about race and gender. But at the time, I think it was really more about 2 cultures and how different they viewed the authority of women and their role, and what they were willing to accept or acknowledge. Because we know, in terms of Roman law, in order to become a citizen, you could be from somewhere else, and as long as you served in the army, you could become a citizen, right? So there were methods by which people could essentially gain authority and be able to own land and control monies and gift generational wealth, all of those kinds of things that we use to assess what the impacts are in terms of culture. Those are still playing out. It just, I think, as Sherry, you said, it feels like maybe at the time, I mean, calling her a gypsy, that certainly feels like a racial slur to me. But it doesn't feel super specific about her Alexandrian location, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And indeed, I may add to that for too long, our view of the ancient world, of the ancient Mediterranean world, of the Roman world has been very Eurocentric. And this conception that Romans were white and the Egyptians were black. But there are a lot of new studies, very interesting studies about blackness in the ancient world, blackness in the Roman world as well. So there were different skin colors as well as in Egypt, and we don't know indeed who is the grandmother of Cleopatra. She could have been one of the many concubines that the Ptolemaic rulers had beside the main queen. And so she could have been an Egyptian woman from the south. The Egyptians from the south have darker skin than the Egyptian of the north. They are represented, these different color of skins, in Egyptian reliefs since the second millennium BC. And for them was a way to recognize ethnic identity of the people while they were moving through the Nile Valley or the neighbor country. But the issue of race, as we consider it and discuss it today, did not belong to that particular time. They weren't racist, let's say that.
And we don't know specifically a lot of, probably at the time, extremely well documented history, because it was lost in the fires in Alexandria. So we are left to some retelling of history, and we have a very popular one is the Shakespearean treatment of Cleopatra. Elkanah, would you like to talk? I'd love to hear you talk about kind of how that was for you, this treatment, how it was limiting, how it was problematic, how you had to reconcile maybe your own personal belief about who Cleopatra was, the missing information, because in reading it, you know how she feels a lot, but you don't necessarily know what she's thinking. It was one thing I really missed. Like, this is a very smart, it's very, very smart. That's an understatement. Yeah, well, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in looking at Shakespeare, I mean, she's one of his great characters in the entire canon in terms of roles that he wrote that were female. She's like at one of the top, you know, in terms of levels of intelligence and savvy and political machination and, you know, empathy and capacity to love and a complicated, you know, vain, the whole thing about being, you know, a queen and a human, which rests in all of Shakespeare, you know, that's all of those royal stories, the conflict between being a human being and being a divine ruler, you know, is carried by all of those stories. So I didn't go to Shakespeare finding him lacking. I actually, the more I researched true his like to, you know, the Battle of Actium and Donations of Alexandria, the more I came up surprised and delighted by the details that Shakespeare had accounted for and really clearly had done his research. So, I mean, the difficult thing is that we just, as you say, don't have an Egyptian account. We really only have a Roman lens, which is, you know, history is written by the victors, and that's the reality sandwich of what we're dealing with. So there's vast amounts of space inside of what Shakespeare wrote to contain her infinite variety. And I think that that's so compelling and wonderful because, you know, she's such a complicated character and so rich and deep and faceted that you could never hit bottom, you know, in terms of the inventiveness and exploration of what she's capable of. And that's the kind of role that any performer wants to totally dig into. I will say that as we investigated the Battle of Actium, Shakespeare does not give her specific reason why she bails, and then Anthony follows, which was his, own discretion and decision that he made, which was a failed decision, arguably on his part, but maybe not. There's ambiguity that lies in those decisions, but we know that she carried the chest of wealth with her, and if she had forfeited that or gotten sunk, that would have been the end of it. There would be no regrouping to battle another day, and so. Just to say that leaving a battle doesn't necessarily mean, losing the war or whatnot. And unfortunately, in their case, it did lead to them losing fundamentally. But at the time, it could have been a strategic retreat. So, yeah. She's tough and complicated and juicy. And that's what's so awesome about her character.
Let's take a moment to talk a little bit about how Cleopatra has captured the popular imagination, how she's still very much alive today in anything from fashion to stories to there's a new Cleopatra movie coming out.
And that's interesting because Gal Gadot, announced that she was going to be a part of that, and she's Israeli, and there was a whole backlash against a big storm on social media about representation, and is that okay or is that problematic, and is she just going to move into the role of producing? And clearly Cleopatra is very much alive and kicking in the public imagination, and I think, speaking, Sherry, to your comment earlier about race and how important it is now. When you were asking us the other day, Erin, like, who is Cleopatra to each of us? Not that you're asking now, but I guess I feel like her mutability and her ability to fulfill a vision for kind of any woman, no matter what she might look like or where she comes from, that she can be such an inspiration and such, a force is a huge gift in terms of like the bigger picture. I think that it could ascend beyond race.
We have just a couple minutes before we're going to take questions, but I would love to hear how are there people currently in politics, in media, in economics who are manifesting the spirit of Cleopatra, and who are they?
I'm quiet.
It's an interesting question
at the moment because it's a lot to fulfill in a person. So, I'm thinking of, okay, savvy women. Yes, we have them across the board. Strategic women. Yes, there are some of those too.
It's hard to be all of them.
It's hard to be all of them.
Who's manifesting some of those?
Seductress, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Relationships, that's what is like the other social things. That's where it's a little hard because savvy politicians normally don't come off of having multiple lovers, and all these other things because that's looked down upon politically. So I'm trying to rack my brain. But ladies, if you have an example.
I mean, we talked in terms of the crafting of her public image and the authority that she carries, beyond the sphere of music or performance and pop culture. Just that, the joke was among the designers, if Jay-Z and Beyoncé broke up, who else could they be with? Because there's no one at that sort of stratospheric level in that rarefied air that could understand and appreciate person to person what it is that they have to balance and level every day. And I think that Coachella, her documentary, which was extremely controlled and very well articulated and produced, gave the impression of being sort of, a personable documentary, but was, an incredible strategic PR you know, acumen to the top level kind of experience. And she continues to do that, you know, over and over again. So I know it's not in the sphere of like politics. And then you look at somebody like Oprah and everyone's like, is she going to run for president? Will she ever run for president? You know, I think she's patently said no, but, you know,
if you could meld these people, Beyonce and Oprah and Angela Merkel and the Prime Minister of Myanmar, and right, there's not one person. And Lizzo, put some Lizzo in there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting to think about. Also, the lens of Western sort of prudishness and judgment that lies around the whole sphere of sexuality and the empowerment of a woman's ability to express or celebrate or really inhabit that space, which I think is the needle's been moving. We've got fourth wave feminism, there's a declaration, but it's like, you know, why is it that politicians can't be sexualized and, you know, have lovers or have children, you know, with multiple people? Like that's certainly not in the United States, but there are people who do that in other countries.
and I like to think that there are a lot of Cleopatras around, but only we don't know about them because nobody has been writing. So it's Cleopatra is really probably a bit everywhere around us, but we don't know.
Absolutely.
Not everyone is a biographer. But,
I see that Cole is back, and we might be taking some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. What a great conversation this has been, everybody. Thank you so much. It's been interesting to see that most of the questions coming my way, you all seem to then immediately answer. So I know you didn't know what was being asked, but you just had this magical gift of transitioning into the questions people wanted answers to. One of which, actually several people, they really seem to be wanting a list of the people that are comparable to Cleopatra, both in history and contemporary times. And you were just discussing that. But I think that was more of a contemporary lens that we were just using. So perhaps, are there some names we can drop from history that are comparable to Cleopatra, either in her beauty and power or the way in which she was treated or mistreated?
Well, Shakespeare's time, I mean, he obviously there's a powerful female monarch ruling then. And obviously we just lost the queen here, even though she's sort of more of a figurehead than, you know, the exclusive political leader. But yeah, I mean, in terms of history in England, there's definitely been notable women who have ruled.
There's also Wu Zhao, who lived in from 624 to 705 BC, and she was the only female leader of a dynasty during a period of amazing abundance and social services and social programs. She's not mentioned much, but she was it.
And again, it comes back to our previous conversation prior to this particular, you know, meeting, where it was like, who are these women? And why is it that we can only count them on maybe one or two hands? And that's fundamentally a problem.
Well, I think it's
a big problem.
Because Cleopatra is so pushed as a beauty. I mean, that's so problematic for me because she was probably such a compelling character that why wouldn't you be totally excited about this person that makes anybody really attractive? So when you try and that, it's just not real, right? So there's plenty of people. Eleanor Roosevelt, amazing. Joan of Arc, incredible woman. Mother Teresa.
There's some question about whether Cleopatra really was such a knockout, or if it was all of her, you know, rhetorical powers and, you know, intelligence, because Lord knows we all, you know, are attracted to people who are smart, talented, and funny. And it might not be that their visage is such a knockout as much as their inner beauty emanates. So I've always felt like that's part of Cleopatra's story, just for me personally, that it wasn't about, you know, what she looked like on the barge from a distance floating down, but it was in the encounter, you know, really with her mind and heart and spirit that, you know, was so potent that overwhelmed.
There's a
And I
saying.
know- oh,
Go
just
ahead,
that,
Rita.
this is not my opinion, but once I remember I found an article where Hillary Clinton was considered a modern day Cleopatra.
Wait, Hillary Clinton?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wondered if Hillary was going to come into this conversation. A
Because
final
they
question.
were connected to powerful, famous men. But
Mm.
in
Oh.
that case, I was like, okay.
Interesting. A final question for you all, and this is another concept that has come up a few times in questions and also in your own discussion. Why aren't men treated with the same scrutiny that our dear poor Cleopatra has had throughout history? Of course, there's no answer to that other than
I don't know if it's scrutiny as much as speculation because we just
Speculation,
don't know.
criticism.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that she's only been, I mean, she hasn't only been played down. She's certainly been celebrated, I think, even inside of the play that Shakespeare wrote. So again, it's complicated. And I think, you know, you start to get into issues around even just talking about gender. And somebody the other day said, you know, women can procreate, men can't. And then I was thinking later on a walk, well, we wouldn't be here without men too, right? Like it takes all of us. So
takes a village.
yeah, it does take a village.
And a final yes or no question for each of you. If Cleopatra did not have the beauty that she was portrayed to, would we still be talking about her? Do you think she'd still have the significance if it didn't come with that mysticism of beauty?
I think we would, but it wouldn't have such vitriol about her. You know, you have Joan of Arc, so she would have been a strong figure like others. But I think because she had the beauty, or she knew how to play that asset to its highest level, that's why she is like kind of more renowned for being the forefront of leaning into all of her strategic abilities in looks, sexuality, power, strategic thinking, relationships. So I think she is just one of those who is on the top level of being interesting all the way around and not in just one or two dimensions.
Absolutely. And I see the rest of you nodding. For interest of time, I assume that means you agree.
Yes.
I agree, but I would also say maybe not, it's not her beauty, but it's her kind of empowered sexuality, which is really like the new face of feminism now is so amazing from when I was a young woman. It's really voluptuous. It's really using that in a positive way and not as, in a way, as a whore. So I would say it's not so much about beauty, but how she used her sexuality.
Interesting. Thank you. All righty, everyone. Well, thank you to our audience for those of you that posed some questions there. And I'm so glad that I think we actually answered all of them, or almost all of them. So on behalf of the Commonwealth Club and the Department of Diversity, Equity, and Community at San Francisco Opera, a heartfelt thank you to Erin Neff, Rita Lucarelli, Elkanah Pulitzer, and Sherry Young for taking part in today's panel discussion. We encourage you all to attend, if you have not already, San Francisco Opera's critically acclaimed world premiere of John Adams' Antony and Cleopatra. Currently on stage at the War Memorial Opera House, this production runs through October 5th. We also hope to see you at the numerous and exciting productions and events we have lined up throughout our centennial season. For tickets and more information, please visit our website at www.sfopera.com. And of course, we invite everyone to keep tuning in at commonwealthclub.org for an impressive array of thought-provoking content and programming. Again, the recording of our panel discussion today will be available later this month under the club's website's Watch and Listen tab. We are delighted that you joined us today during this, the Commonwealth Club's 119th year of enlightened public discussion. I'm Cole Thomas Enritis. This meeting is adjourned.